These are Samizdat broadcasts. Ideas matter. When bad ideas take root, there are consequences that go beyond absurd and laughable spectacles. Real people in the real world get hurt. Worst of all is when bad ideas manipulate language in twisted Orwellian ways to make real abuse of real people seem like a necessary measure to redress injustice. In February 2016, an article appeared on the social justice blog, Everyday Feminism, that displayed an unintentionally high degree of self-awareness for this particular blog and the ideology it represents. In the article, entitled 7 Ways Social Justice Language Can Become Abusive in Intimate Relationships, the author describes a frightening scene. A few years ago, I took a deep breath, looked one of my closest friends in the eye, and told him that I thought he should stop beating up his boyfriend. He blinked at me in surprise. He shook his head as if he couldn't believe what I was saying. Then he said, "But it isn't abuse if I hit him. I'm more oppressed than he is." It was my turn to shake my head in disbelief as I struggled to get a grip on what was happening, what was true, what I believed, what my responsibility in the situation was. Let me make this process of getting a grip easier for you. This is the end result of ideological reductionism. The social justice movement, as it calls itself, is reductionistic in that it reduces the vast complexities of human nature and human interaction down to the single factor of people belonging to privileged groups, such as whites, males, or heterosexuals, and marginalized groups, such as women, peoples of color, or homosexuals. What's wrong with this, you might ask? Is this not an accurate assessment of how wealth, power, opportunity, and so on are divided in our society? To a degree, yes. But there's a big difference between pointing out that there have been, and to some extent continue to be, imbalances and inequalities across demographic lines, on the one hand, and viewing these imbalances and inequalities as the motive determining force in all human relations on the other. The balance of power in human relationships is complex and highly dependent on specific contexts and circumstances. Ideologies that categorize people in broad strokes as privileged or marginalized are tempting to fall back on, since they simplify an otherwise complex issue. But this always comes at a cost. Social justice, as an ideology, lends itself to the kinds of abuse described above. The author of the article describes the rationalization behind it perfectly. It was true that my friend was, on a systemic level, more oppressed. He was racialized, and his boyfriend was white. He was raised in a working-class family, and his boyfriend was upper-middle class. Like me, my friend had grown up knowing trauma after trauma as a result of systemic oppression, while his boyfriend had lived a life of relative privilege. Feminism, anti-racism, queer and trans advocacy, and other kinds of social justice-based thinking also recognize that people of certain identities, for example, whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality, are given greater power and privilege in society. Because of this social power imbalance, social justice communities tend to believe that it is much easier for men to abuse women, white people to abuse people of color, and so on. Social statistics on intimate partner violence support this belief, and this is what I have always believed, as a feminist and an activist. But in that moment with my friend, I was forced to wonder, does this mean that a more oppressed person can never be responsible for abusing a less oppressed person? Can a woman never abuse a man, or a racialized person a white person? It must be said that not all advocates of social justice ideologies abuse in these ways. Most don't, and abuse along the trajectories that social justice would suggest as the norm for abusive behavior does happen and is wrong. But something is also terribly wrong when an advocate of social justice actually has to stop and ask herself if it is possible for a woman to abuse a man, or a racialized person a white person. Ideology should never substitute for specific circumstantial context. And how many times had I, in moments of fear, terrified of being abandoned yet again by a white, cisgender male partner, resorted to using the only power I had, the language of feminism and social justice, words that had given me strength and saved my life when no one would, to try and seize control of my relationships. The author here so much as admits to using the ideological angle provided by social justice for personal advantage, which is well within the scope of human nature to do. Give a person an advantage and don't be surprised if, at some point, they end up exploiting it. I'll refer you to the Stanford Prison Experiment, which I won't detail here, look it up yourself, as exemplary of how quickly and easily human nature will exploit power differentials given the opportunity. In this, social justice is quite right to be concerned about power differentials and social privilege. But by taking such a reductionistic view of privilege and identity, social justice opens itself up to precisely these kinds of abuses, even if open advocacy of such abuse is rare. The article continues, because it's true that social oppression plays itself out in romantic and sexual relationships. Too often privileged people hurt and exploit their marginalized partners, and are never held accountable for their actions. But there is a difference between expressing oppressive relationship dynamics in order to expose privilege and incite self-reflection, and manipulating the language of social justice to win a fight with your partner. There is a big difference between pointing out that your partner is more privileged than you and using that fact as an excuse for hitting them. And no, to privileged folk reading this article, this is not an excuse to shut down or ignore your racialized, disabled, transgender, or otherwise marginalized partner when they tell you that you're being oppressive to them. If anything, this is about learning how to listen more carefully to what they're saying, and why they might be saying it. Please check yourselves. Well, we could just make this simple and just agree that certain kinds of behaviors are wrong no matter who does them, but for reasons that should be becoming obvious, social justice doesn't really want to go there. We need to start looking at the ways in which social justice ideas, the same ideas that liberate and empower us, can also be used to harm and dominate people. Hear, hear. And here's a quick rundown of the 7 ways the article suggests this can happen. 1. Using identity to avoid accountability for physical or emotional abuse. 2. Using desirability politics to coerce someone into sex or sexual activity. 3. Disguising putting down and shaming your partner as calling out oppression. 4. Forcing someone to stay in a relationship for anti-oppressive reasons. 5. Making an intimate partner feel responsible for life or death. 6. Choosing to call out some power dynamics while ignoring others. And 7. Using oppression to deny one's own agency. I won't spend too long on these, their manipulative nature should be rather plain now. Regarding the first one, the author differentiates between physical abuse and self-defense, suggesting that abuse victims have the right to defend themselves, regardless of identity, and I agree fully. Then goes on to say a bit later in the article. But as we continued to discuss the situation, it became clear that my friend was not defending himself from being attacked. Rather, he admitted he was lashing out at his partner in response to his own insecurities. And he was using his identity as a person of color with a working-class background to avoid taking responsibility for that. One wonders how much internet feminism really boils down to stuff like this. None of this means that marginalized people shouldn't name their identities and privilege disparities in intimate relationships. Privileged people need to know if they're being oppressive to their partners. Or, like I say, we can all just kinda act decent to one another, unless given cause to do otherwise. Like when some SJW piece of shit tries to milk their marginalized status to justify acting like a douchebag. 2. Using desirability politics to coerce somebody into sex or sexual activity. In social justice communities, the conversation about oppressive standards of beauty and sexual desire has just begun. It is a powerful, extremely painful conversation that is also extremely necessary. We need to talk about how trans folks, fat folks, disabled folks, elders, and people of color are far too often portrayed as ugly and undesirable in the media. We need to talk about how this dynamic plays out in real life, as individuals being ridiculed, harassed, shamed, and romantically or sexually invisibilized in awful, traumatic ways. Would any of this apply to the kinds of young men that online feminists call neckbeards or gloat over not being able to get laid? Romantically or sexually invisibilizing is the go-to first argument for many an online feminist facing any kind of debate, especially from a guy. It's a shitty tactic that is consistently used to hand-wave counter-arguments to their theories, implying that a male is somehow less of a man for being single, not being sexually active, being in poverty, hence living in his mother's basement, or whatever, is the last thing that feminists of all people have any business doing. But it's considered quite witty in their circles, and it's done all the time. So long as it's against a guy who doesn't follow the party line, without question. 3. Disguising putting down and shaming your partner as calling out oppression. In many feminist and activist communities, it's common to place value on the practice of calling out individuals for oppressive behaviors. This is, on occasion, justified. More often than not, especially online these days, this is all about status signaling and establishing dominance. Call-outs are more or less confrontational and involve educating, sometimes very aggressively, people about how their use of social privilege can hurt or marginalize less privileged folks. 9 times out of 10, this is all about making sure everybody knows who's boss. Who the most militant, or the most educated, or simply the most oppressed special snowflake on the entire blog really is. Generally speaking, it's a good rule of thumb that anyone who needs to trample on others in this way to signal their status is an asshole, and any group or scene that thrives on this kind of behavior is bullying and oppressive. Later, but calling out takes an abusive turn when it isn't targeted to specific behaviors and becomes more about instilling a constant sense of shame and uncertainty in a partner. This kind of calling out often looks like attacking someone's identity for no reason or to dominate them. Yeah, that's the business model. Only my feelings on this conflict matter, because you're privileged, so get over it. Third wave feminism and social justice perfectly summarized in a single sentence. Bravo. 4. Forcing someone to stay in a relationship for anti-oppressive reasons. A key aspect of many abusive relationships is emotionally blackmailing the abused partner into staying in the relationship. 5. Making an intimate partner feel responsible for life or death. One of the most effective ways of keeping someone trapped in a relationship is by making them feel responsible for whether you live or die. People who strongly believe in social justice can be particularly sensitive to this, because the truth is that marginalized people are very often truly isolated and cut off from resources. This is part of the definition of oppression. Here, the language of social justice and oppression becomes a powerful tool for abuse, because in social justice communities, we are taught to take people's words about their oppression at face value. I can't say I'm surprised to learn that stuff like this goes on in social justice communities. It should go without saying, however, that it goes on outside social justice communities as well. They are not uniquely guilty of this, but it's easy to see why they'd be especially vulnerable to it. Emotional blackmail is pretty much the stock and trade of social justice circles. Its claims are backed by the implication, sometimes stated outright, that to disagree at all equates to racism, misogyny, or the like. This is the kind of manipulation you enable when your ideology explicitly denies certain people the right to their own voice, or even their own outlook, based on characteristics like race or gender. Social justice is rife with statements like, women can't be sexist, or whites don't get to decide what's racist. I can only hope that the depressed and those cut off from access to resources can find the help that they need. The problem here is less that a desperate and hurting individual will try to do whatever they can to cling on to any lifeline they can grab hold of. Understandable behavior in desperate circumstances, a moral worldview that both enables and justifies this sort of emotional manipulation in order to accomplish that. 6. Choosing to call out some power dynamics while ignoring others. When social justice politics are being used abusively, only certain power dynamics get talked about. The power dynamics that help the perpetrator of abuse maintain control and avoid accountability. And 7. Using oppression to deny one's own agency. The abuse of social justice language to attack and dominate intimate partners is based on the compelling yet deeply flawed idea that experiencing oppression completely absolves us of responsibility and agency for our own actions and our own lives. Given what we should know about human nature by now, these dangers should be rather obvious. Mentally healthy people with strong critical thinking skills would be naturally inoculated against these kinds of tactics. But social justice ideology, at least in its present politically correct form, has an insidious way of eroding these protections. They play on our desire to do good and stand up for the underdog. Once we accept the reasonable proposition that certain groups are more discriminated against than other groups, it's not so much of a stretch to accept the idea that some monolithic, hegemonic system of oppression exists to keep all of the disadvantaged people down for the benefit of the privileged. This allows for guilt by association and collective responsibility. Ironically, this lends itself to its own form of power imbalance in the relationship, and human nature being what it is, should it surprise us that it is at least sometimes exploited? Of particular interest, I thought, was this little gem. One huge power dynamic at play here is the ability to fluently speak the language of feminism and anti-oppression itself. Having the education and mental capacity to think and talk about one's experiences in terms of systemic power and privilege is not something everybody has access to. This could be a whole other video. Suffice it to say, however, that it speaks to a deep hypocrisy in the present-day social justice movement. Its theories were developed in high academia, hardly a place I'd go in search of genuinely marginalized people, and its theories are disseminated both in academia and in social media that markets to a demographic with sufficient economic clout to justify marketing mass media towards. No theory of social justice is going to be marketed towards the truly impoverished and marginalized because they either can't afford the tuition to attend a university, or they don't have the disposable income necessary to draw advertisers to any media that would appeal to them. This has always been, I've noticed, social justice's dirty little secret. It is a movement of the upper middle class, and the privileged folks it often so delights in calling out are frequently lower class versions of themselves. But there is always a choice. If we have the strength and resilience and ingenuity to survive oppression, then we have the strength to choose not to abuse each other. Indeed, there is always a choice. The choice I've made is to turn my back on this horrendous bastardization of social justice, and chosen instead to believe the much simpler, much easier, and much better notion of individual responsibility and accountability. It's shitty for anyone to abuse anyone. This isn't to say we can't pay attention to grievances and issues that certain demographics experience more disproportionately. To not do this would be intellectually dishonest. But to deny that social justice in its present form has degenerated into an oppression Olympics dominated by a pervasive culture of weaponized grievance would also be intellectually dishonest. Once any group starts with these relative deprivation arguments, "We have it worse, you're just whining," or something such, this is no longer about anything really worthy of the term social justice and is now just about ego. It's about appropriating and exploiting the identities and suffering of others in order to shield yourself from scrutiny and use unearned guilt as a club to gain dominance over others. It's shitty behavior, and it has no place in our personal relationships, no place in our public and cyber social spaces. It has no place in academia, and it has no place in our public policy-making institutions at any level. The sooner this is widely understood and accepted, the better off we'll all be. This has been Simi's.Broadcasts. Over and out.